One of the most unsettling yet liberating realizations in philosophy is the recognition that the self we instinctively defend, improve, and fear losing is not what it appears to be. Because the feeling of being a separate I seems so obvious and intimate that questioning it feels absurd. Yet upon closer examination, this sense of self reveals itself as a mental construction rather than an independent entity. And this construction is assembled from memories, labels, social roles, and expectations woven together by language into a narrative that gives the impression of continuity. Yet experience itself is not continuous in this way. Because thoughts arise and pass, emotions fluctuate, sensations change, and perceptions shift moment by moment. And there is no fixed core that remains unchanged through these variations, and the mind fills this gap by inventing a center, an observer imagined to stand behind experience rather than as part of it. And this imagined center is what we call the ego. And the ego's primary function is not to perceive reality, but to maintain a sense of control, identity, and predictability. Because without a stable self-story, the world feels ambiguous and threatening, and ambiguity challenges a desire for certainty. Yet this desire is itself the source of much suffering, because reality is inherently uncertain, fluid, and relational, and trying to force it into fixed categories creates friction, and this friction is experienced as anxiety, defensiveness, and dissatisfaction. And the ego interprets these feelings as personal problems rather than as signals that its assumptions are flawed, and so it responds by reinforcing itself, tightening its boundaries, and intensifying identification with thoughts, opinions, and roles. And this intensification creates the illusion of solidity. Yet it is precisely the solidity that produces suffering, because anything imagined to be fixed in a changing world is vulnerable, and the ego lives in constant fear of being threatened, diminished, or erased. And this fear shapes behavior in subtle ways, driving competition, comparison, and the need for validation. And these behaviors are exhausting because they require constant maintenance of an image that can never be fully secured, because it depends on external conditions and internal narratives that are always shifting, and this instability is misinterpreted as a flaw in the individual, rather than as evidence that the self being defended is conceptual rather than real. And recognizing this distinction is transformative, because it reveals that suffering is not inherent to life, but to identification, the act of mistaking thoughts and roles for what one is. And this mistake is understandable because language encourages it, using nouns to describe processes, turning dynamic events into static objects. And when this linguistic habit is applied to consciousness, it produces the idea of a thing called me rather than an ongoing activity of experiencing. And this activity has no center, no boundary, and no fixed location. Yet it feels personal because it is intimate, and intimacy is mistaken for ownership. Yet awareness does not belong to anyone. It is simply happening, and this happening includes thoughts of self just as it includes sounds, sensations, and emotions. And seeing this dissolves a hierarchy that places the self above experience as its controller, revealing instead that the self is one of the experiences, arising within awareness. And this reversal undermines the ego's authority, because it reveals that there is no central manager directing life, only a continuous interplay of conditions giving rise to events. And this realization aligns with Taoist philosophy, which emphasizes that the universe operates without a ruler, through spontaneous order rather than centralized control. And humans are not exceptions to this pattern. Yet the ego imagines itself as a ruler, attempting to command thoughts, emotions, and outcomes. And this command is partial at best, because thoughts arise unbidden, emotions emerge unpredictably, and outcomes depend on countless factors beyond personal influence. And resisting this reality produces frustration, because the ego measures itself against an impossible standard of autonomy, and this measurement generates guilt and shame when control fails, reinforcing the belief that something is wrong with the individual. Yet, what is wrong is the assumption that there should be a self in charge, and letting go of this assumption does not lead to chaos, but to relief, because it removes the burden of authorship, the belief that one must be the sole cause of thoughts, feelings, and actions. And this relief is often mistaken for passivity, yet it is actually clarity, because it allows actions to arise from the situation rather than from a defended identity, and actions arising in this way are often more appropriate, because they are informed by the whole, context rather than by self-image. And this contextual responsiveness feels like flow, because effort is not wasted on maintaining an image, and attention is free to engage with what is happening, and this engagement is what produces effectiveness and creativity, because creativity requires openness, and openness is impossible when the ego is busy protecting itself, and protection narrows perception, while openness expands it, allowing connections to be seen, and these connections are the basis of understanding, because understanding is relational rather than possessive, and this relational understanding reveals that the boundary between self and world is porous, because sensations, thoughts, and emotions arise in response to conditions, and conditions include the environment, culture, relationships, and history, and recognizing this interdependence dissolves the myth of the isolated self, replacing it with a sense of belonging, because one is not alone inside a body confronting an external world, but a pattern within a larger pattern, and this belonging reduces fear, because fear thrives on isolation, and isolation is a conceptual artifact of egoic thinking, and when this artifact is seen through, compassion arises naturally, because others are no longer perceived as separate entities competing for survival, but as expressions of the same process, and this perception transforms relationships, because interactions are no longer transactions between defended selves, but meetings within a shared field of experience, and this shared field is what many traditions refer to as awareness, not as an object, but as a context in which objects appear. And awareness has no boundaries, because boundaries appear within it. And identify with awareness rather than with a self-image produces a sense of freedom, because awareness is not threatened by change. And this freedom is not the freedom to do whatever one wants, but the freedom from the need to be someone in particular. And this need is the source of much tension, because it creates a constant gap between what is and what should be, and living in this gap generates dissatisfaction, because it is oriented toward an imagined future rather than the present, and this orientation prevents full engagement with life, because attention is split between experience and evaluation reinforces identity because it judges experience in relation to the self-story, and dropping this evaluation does not eliminate the summit, but it removes